Ma'am, I'm quoting the law exactly as it's written.
No, officer, that's not correct. The statute you're referencing applies only to commercial vehicles. My car doesn't fall under that classification.
Are you trying to disrespect me? You think you know my job better than I do?
I'm not disrespecting you. I'm informing you. And your traffic stop is not legal. You cannot initiate a stop based on what you think.
Ma'am, you need to stop talking like you're teaching a class.
I could teach one if I wanted to, but right now I'm explaining why your stop violates the Fourth Amendment.
You're twisting things. I know what I'm doing.
Then tell me the exact code section that authorizes this stop.
You're being argumentative.
No, officer, I'm being accurate. You pulled me over because of my skin color, and you know it. And now you realize the stop itself won't hold up.
Ma'am, listen.
The night was quiet on Highway 47, with only a few cars passing under the orange lights that illuminated the asphalt wet from recent rain. Megan Carter was driving carefully toward her apartment after a long study session at the law school library. She had just reviewed Fourth Amendment cases for her final exams, not knowing that knowledge would be tested in a way far more real than any academic exam could simulate. Her constitutional law textbooks were stacked in the back seat, her notes on Supreme Court precedents scattered beside an already cold bottle of coffee. She was one of the top students in her class, known for her photographic memory and her ability to quote legal cases word for word. But at that moment, she was just tired, thinking about the hot shower she'd take at home and the few hours of sleep before morning classes. That's when the red and blue lights exploded in her rearview mirror. Megan's heart raced for a second, that instinctive reaction anyone has when they see a police car behind them. She mentally checked everything she'd done in the last few minutes. She wasn't over the speed limit, had used her turn signal for every lane change. Her headlights were working perfectly. There was absolutely no reason to be pulled over. Still, she signaled, slowed down, and parked carefully on the shoulder, exactly as any responsible driver would. She placed her hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen, kept her movements slow and deliberate. She had learned this not in law school, but through difficult conversations her mother had with her as a teenager, those conversations that black families need to have about how to survive encounters with police. The officer who stepped out of the patrol car and walked toward her vehicle was Joseph Brennan, a 10-year veteran of the local police force. He had a reputation in the department, though nobody talked openly about it. There were filed complaints, stories whispered among community members, patterns that anyone paying attention could recognize. But he had never faced real consequences, had never been forced to explain why he stopped certain drivers far more frequently than others. That night, he had seen Megan driving, had taken note of her skin color through the window, and had decided she looked suspicious. There was no crime, no traffic violation, just a judgment based on prejudice dressed in the authority of a badge. He approached the car with the posture of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, expecting this stop to be like all the hundreds of others he'd made before. Before we continue, where are you watching this from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. This story gets intense, and you won't want to miss what happens next. When Brennan knocked on Megan's window with his knuckles, making that authoritative sound officers use to establish control, he had no idea he was about to face someone who knew the law better than he did, himself. Megan rolled down the window just a few inches, enough for communication, but not enough to give the officer unrestricted access to the vehicle's interior. She had learned this too, not in the elegant law school classrooms, but in practical civil rights seminars she attended on Wednesday nights. Brennan didn't say good evening, didn't properly introduce himself, didn't explain the reason for the stop. Instead, he immediately demanded license and registration, his voice loaded with that impatience, suggesting he expected immediate and unquestioning obedience. But Megan wasn't the type of person who obeyed blindly, especially when she knew her rights were being violated. She looked directly at Brennan and asked the question that would change everything. She asked what the legal basis for the stop was, using exactly the language she had studied in her books, the same phrasing Supreme Court justices used when writing their opinions. Her voice was calm but firm, respectful, but not submissive. She wasn't being difficult. She was exercising her constitutional rights. She was doing exactly what the law allowed citizens to do when confronted with governmental authority. The expression on Brennan's face changed instantly. He wasn't used to being questioned. He certainly wasn't used to being questioned by someone who clearly knew what they were talking about. And what he said next, what he did during the next 30 minutes, would be captured on crystal clear video and become evidence that would end his career and prove exactly why knowledge of the law is the most powerful weapon a citizen can have. Brennan repeated the order, this time with more aggression in his voice, saying Megan needed to hand over her license and registration immediately or things would get much worse for her. It was a veiled threat, the kind of intimidation he had used hundreds of times before, successfully. Most people handed over documents immediately when an officer raised his voice, when the situation started to feel like it could escalate into something dangerous. But Megan didn't move. She kept her hands on the steering wheel, kept her voice calm, and repeated her question with even more legal precision. She specifically cited the decision in Terry v. Ohio from 1968, explaining that an officer needs reasonable and articulable suspicion of criminal activity to justify a traffic stop. She wasn't reciting this from memory by chance. She had literally studied this case that same afternoon, had written a 10-page analysis about how the decision balanced public safety with individual rights. Now she was applying that knowledge in real time, transforming academic theory into practical defense. Brennan's body camera was recording everything, every word, every expression, every moment of this interaction. He didn't know it yet, but that small camera attached to his uniform was documenting the end of his career. Megan had also started recording on her phone, which she discreetly positioned on the car's dashboard with the camera pointing at the window. She knew that in situations like this, video evidence was absolutely crucial. She had seen too many cases where it was a civilian's word against an officer's word, and the officer always won unless there was irrefutable proof, so she made sure she would have that proof. Brennan noticed the phone and immediately ordered her to stop recording, saying she was interfering with an official investigation. But Megan knew the law on this aspect too. She calmly informed him that citizens have the constitutional right to record police officers performing their duties in public spaces, citing precedent established in the First Circuit Court of Appeals. Now Brennan was visibly irritated. His jaw was tense. His hands moved nervously near the utility belt where his weapon and handcuffs were. He wasn't used to encountering resistance, especially not the kind of informed and articulated resistance Megan was presenting. He tried a different tactic, saying he had stopped Megan because she was driving erratically, changing lanes without properly signaling. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Megan immediately pointed out that she had used her turn signal for every lane change, that she had maintained consistent speed, that there was absolutely no evidence of erratic driving. She then went even further, explaining that even if he had observed a minor traffic violation, that didn't give him the right to make certain demands without additional probable cause. She was systematically dismantling every justification he tried to build, using precise legal language that made it clear she wasn't guessing or bluffing. Quick question for everyone watching. Have you ever been in a situation where you were doing everything right, but someone with authority tried to make it seem like you were wrong? Type yes in the comments. Brennan then changed tactics again, this time claiming he could smell marijuana coming from the vehicle and that this gave him probable cause to search the car. It was another lie, more blatant than the first. There was no smell of marijuana because Megan had never used drugs in her entire life. She was meticulously careful about everything, knew that as a black woman, she couldn't afford to give police any legitimate reason for trouble. But she also knew that the claim of detecting drug odor was one of the most commonly used and hardest to contest excuses because it leaves no physical evidence. Officers could claim they smelled something, and it was practically impossible to prove otherwise. Except Megan had an answer for that too. She calmly informed Brennan that the claim of odor detection would need to be specific and articulable, that he would need to be able to describe exactly what he detected, where it was coming from, and why his experience and training led to the conclusion it was marijuana specifically versus any other odor. She cited recent court decisions about how odor claims were increasingly being scrutinized by courts, especially in states where marijuana had been legalized or decriminalized. She pointed out that even if he genuinely detected some odor, that didn't automatically create probable cause for a warrantless search under certain circumstances. Every word coming out of her mouth was precise, was grounded in actual case law, was exactly the kind of argument an experienced criminal defense attorney would make. Brennan was being completely outmatched by someone he had assumed would be easy to intimidate. The expression on his face went from irritation to something close to panic. He was realizing he had picked the wrong person to harass, that this stop was going in a very different way than he expected, and that he might be in real trouble. Brennan finally realized he was being recorded from multiple angles, and that every word coming out of his mouth was being documented in a way that could be used against him. His body language changed visibly. He stepped back several paces from the vehicle, his hand moving away from the utility belt where it had been hovering dangerously close to his weapon. For the first time since the beginning of the stop, he seemed uncertain about how to proceed. Megan seized this moment of hesitation to ask another crucial question. She asked if she was free to leave, using exactly the legal phrasing that forces an officer to declare whether someone is being detained or is free to go. It was a question that changed everything, because if he said yes, the stop would end immediately. If he said no, he would have to articulate the legal reasons for detaining her, something he clearly couldn't do because no legal reasons existed. Brennan was caught between two bad options, and Megan knew exactly what she had done. He tried to avoid answering directly, saying he was still conducting his investigation. But Megan didn't accept that vague response. She asked specifically what crime he was investigating. She pointed out that a valid traffic stop required reasonable suspicion of criminal activity or traffic violation, and that prolonged investigation without such suspicion constituted illegal detention. She was citing concepts from cases like Rodriguez versus United States, where the Supreme Court ruled that extending a traffic stop beyond the time necessary to handle the original infraction violates the Fourth Amendment. Every legal reference she made was precise and relevant, demonstrating not just theoretical knowledge but practical understanding of how the law worked in real-world situations. Brennan was completely out of his depth, facing someone whose knowledge of the legal system exceeded his by orders of magnitude. Stay with this story because what happens in the next few minutes changes everything. Another patrol car appeared on the scene, its flashing lights adding more blue and red illumination to the already surreal roadside situation. An older officer stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward Brennan with the measured gait of someone who had seen countless traffic stops and could usually assess a situation quickly. His name was Sergeant Mitchell, and he had 23 years of experience in the department. Brennan called Mitchell aside, and they had a low-voiced conversation that Brennan's body camera only partially captured. What was clear, even from the audible fragments, was that Brennan was trying to frame the situation in a way that made him look reasonable. He mentioned that the driver was being uncooperative, that she was recording, that she was questioning his authority. But Mitchell had seen situations like this before. Mitchell walked up to Megan's car window, and immediately his approach was different. He introduced himself properly, spoke in a respectful tone, and asked if he could have a conversation with her about what was happening. Megan responded with courtesy but maintained her firmness. She explained that she had repeatedly asked for the legal basis for the stop and had received no satisfactory answer. She detailed the various false allegations Brennan had made about erratic driving and marijuana odor. She pointed out that she had been on the shoulder for nearly 20 minutes without any actual violation being identified. Mitchell listened carefully, and Megan could see in his expression that he understood this wasn't a routine traffic stop that had been misunderstood. This was a stop that should never have happened in the first place. He looked back at Brennan with an expression mixing disappointment and frustration. Mitchell turned to Megan and did something that surprised even her. He apologized. Not a generic, meaningless apology, but a genuine acknowledgement that she had been stopped without proper cause and that her time had been wasted. He said she was free to go, that there would be no citation, that she didn't need to provide her license or any documentation. It was an implicit admission that the entire stop had been illegal from the beginning. Megan thanked him for his professionalism, but made it clear this didn't end here. She informed both Mitchell and Brennan that she would be filing a formal complaint through appropriate channels. She mentioned that she had complete video documentation of the entire encounter and that she would be consulting with civil rights organizations about appropriate next steps. The expression on Brennan's face when she said this was one of pure dread. He knew he had made a serious mistake, and that mistake had been captured on camera from multiple angles. Does anyone watching think Megan should have just accepted the apology and moved on, or was she right to take this further? Let me know what you think. When Megan finally drove away from that traffic stop, her hands were shaking on the steering wheel, but her mind was clear. She knew exactly what she needed to do. Before she even got home, she had mentally organized the timeline of events, identified all the key points that would need to be documented, and begun listing the organizations she should contact. This wasn't just about her being inconveniently stopped for 20 minutes. This was about a pattern of behavior that had to be exposed and interrupted. Brennan had done this before, she was certain. The confidence with which he had lied about erratic driving and drug odor suggested these were tactics he had used successfully in the past against drivers who didn't know how to challenge him. How many people had been illegally searched, unjustly cited, or even arrested based on his fabrications? That question haunted her. When she arrived at her apartment, Megan immediately began backing up her video recording in multiple places. She uploaded it to cloud storage, copied it to her computer, and sent a copy to a trusted friend with instructions about what to do if something happened to the originals. She had read enough stories about evidence mysteriously disappearing to take every precaution. Then she sat down and wrote a detailed account of everything that had happened while it was still fresh in her memory. Every word Brennan had said, every movement he had made, the specific times when things happened, Mitchell's appearance, and how he had handled the situation differently. Her legal training had taught her that details mattered, that memories faded over time, and that having a contemporaneous account of events was invaluable if this eventually went to any legal proceeding. The next morning, Megan began making contacts. She reached out to the local American Civil Liberties Union, explained what had happened, and sent them a copy of her video recording. She contacted a civil rights organization that specialized in cases of racial profiling and police misconduct. She scheduled a consultation with an attorney who had experience suing police departments for constitutional violations. Every organization she contacted had the same reaction when they saw the video. They were shocked at how clearly it captured Brennan fabricating reasons for the stop, lying about drug odor, and being systematically dismantled by Megan's legal arguments. This wasn't a case where there was ambiguity about what happened or room for interpretation. The cameras had documented everything in meticulous detail. Within a week, the video had been shared with community leaders, civil rights attorneys, and local journalists who covered police accountability issues. The story began to spread. Here was a law student who not only knew her rights, but had articulated them so perfectly that she had essentially given a constitutional law lesson to a police officer during a traffic stop. The contrast was powerful, a young black woman demonstrating more legal knowledge and professionalism than a veteran officer who was supposed to be enforcing the law. Reporters began reaching out to Megan requesting interviews. She agreed to speak with some of them, carefully choosing outlets she felt would report the story fairly and responsibly. She wanted this to be about the systemic problem, not just about her individual experience. The police department initially tried to downplay the incident. They issued a vague statement saying they were investigating a complaint but couldn't comment on personnel matters. They probably hoped the story would blow over, that the news cycle would move on, that Megan would eventually give up on pressing the issue. But they underestimated both her determination and the impact the video had on the community. People who had their own stories of being stopped by Brennan for no apparent reason began coming forward. A black man reported being stopped by the same officer 3 times in 6 months, each time under questionable pretexts, never resulting in any citation because there were no actual violations. A Latina woman described being detained for 40 minutes while Brennan searched her entire car, claiming she looked nervous, eventually finding nothing and letting her go without explanation or apology. The patterns were becoming impossible to ignore. Megan had just been the first person with the resources, knowledge, and determination to properly document what Brennan was doing and take it seriously. Her video recording had opened the floodgates, giving other victims the courage to share their own experiences. A civil rights attorney who reviewed all these accounts identified at least 17 documented cases over 3 years where Brennan had stopped black and Latino drivers under extremely questionable pretexts. In almost every case, the stops had begun with vague allegations of traffic violations that were never substantiated, followed by claims of drug odors or suspicious behavior that justified searches. And in almost every case, nothing illegal was found, because there was nothing to find. These people had simply been racially profiled, harassed, and forced to endure violations of their constitutional freedoms by an officer who apparently believed his badge made him immune to consequences. The pressure on the police department grew exponentially when a national civil rights organization picked up the story. They weren't just interested in Megan's individual case, they were interested in what it revealed about systemic practices within the department. Why had Brennan been able to operate this way for years without significant oversight? Why had previous complaints against him been filed away or dismissed? What kind of training did the department provide about constitutional rights and appropriate traffic stops? These questions demanded answers, and the department's leadership found they could no longer hide behind vague statements about ongoing investigations. The media was covering the story daily. Protests were being organized. City council members were receiving hundreds of calls from constituents demanding accountability. This had transformed into a full-scale public relations crisis. Megan's video of her politely but firmly dismantling every one of Brennan's arguments went viral on social media. People shared it with captions like, "This is what knowing your rights looks like," and "Law student schools cop on the Constitution." It had millions of views across multiple platforms. Law schools began using it in classes as a perfect example of how citizens can and should exercise their rights during police encounters. Civil rights organizations included it in training materials about what to do if you're stopped for no apparent reason. The most powerful part of the video wasn't even the legal confrontation, it was the absolute contrast in professionalism. Megan remained calm, articulate, and respectful even while her rights were being violated. Brennan became increasingly agitated, defensive, and unable to provide coherent justifications for his actions. Anyone watching could clearly see who understood the law and who was abusing authority. Are you still with me? If you're finding this story important, make sure you're subscribed. The department finally announced that Brennan was being placed on administrative leave while a full investigation was conducted. This wasn't a voluntary decision on their part. It was a move forced by relentless public pressure and the threat of legal action that could cost the city millions of dollars. The investigation wouldn't be conducted internally as police investigations usually are, where officers investigate other officers and predictably find no wrongdoing. This time, there was too much attention, too much video documentation, too many witnesses. The city brought in an independent investigator, a former federal prosecutor with experience in civil rights cases. This person owed no favors to anyone in the department and had a reputation for being thorough and impartial. Brennan hired an attorney paid for by the police union, but even his lawyer had to admit the video evidence made this an extremely difficult case to defend. During the investigation, even more disturbing details emerged. Brennan's dash camera, which should have captured his claim that Megan was driving erratically, showed no such thing. The footage clearly showed Megan maintaining her lane perfectly, using appropriate signals, obeying all speed limits. His claim of erratic driving had been a complete fabrication, and his own dash camera proved it. The department had to admit that Brennan had either not reviewed his own footage before making false allegations, or had deliberately lied, hoping nobody would check. Either way, it was evidence of either gross incompetence or intentional bad faith. The investigation also revealed that Brennan had patterns in when and where he made stops. Statistical data analysis showed that 87% of his traffic stops were of non-white drivers, despite the area he patrolled being only 42% non-white. This disparity was statistically impossible to explain through chance. The investigator interviewed Sergeant Mitchell, who had responded to the scene that night. Mitchell gave honest testimony confirming that when he arrived, it was immediately clear Brennan had no legal basis for the stop. Mitchell admitted he had seen Brennan make questionable stops before, but had never formally reported it because he didn't want to be seen as causing trouble for a fellow officer. It was exactly the kind of culture of silence that allows police misconduct to thrive. Officers know when their colleagues are crossing lines, but the unwritten code of loyalty prevents them from speaking up. Mitchell expressed regret for not acting earlier, saying that if he had reported his concerns before, perhaps Megan and others would never have had to experience what they experienced. His testimony was damning, not just for Brennan, but for the department culture that had allowed this behavior to continue. Megan was interviewed extensively by the investigator. She provided her video recording, her detailed written account, and answered hours of questions about exactly what had happened. The investigator was impressed not just with her meticulous evidence collection, but with her legal knowledge. He commented that she would have made a better defense attorney than many practicing lawyers he'd seen. Megan explained that she wasn't doing this for revenge or to profit from a lawsuit. She was doing it because she had the privilege of legal knowledge and resources that many victims of police misconduct don't have, and she felt a responsibility to use those privileges to create change that would benefit other people who came after her. She wanted the department's policies to change. She wanted officers to receive better training on constitutional rights. She wanted accountability systems that actually worked instead of just protecting bad officers. As the investigation continued, Megan's life had changed in ways she never anticipated. She became something of a public figure, recognized on the street by people who had seen her video. Some congratulated her for standing up for herself. Others shared their own stories of police harassment. She received invitations to speak at events, participate in panels about police reform, give interviews to national media outlets. It was overwhelming at times, especially since she was still trying to complete her final year of law school and prepare for final exams. But she also recognized this was an opportunity to amplify an important message about civil rights and police accountability. She accepted invitations selectively, focusing on those where she felt she could have the greatest impact educating people about their rights. Megan's law school was incredibly supportive. Several professors used her case as an example in class with her permission. The dean of the law school publicly praised how she had applied her legal training in a high-pressure, real-world situation. Some of her fellow students reached out asking for advice about how to get involved in civil rights work. She became an informal mentor to students who wanted to use their law degrees for social accountability rather than just getting high-paying corporate jobs. Her story sparked conversations about why diversity matters in the legal profession, why students from underrepresented backgrounds bring valuable perspectives that come from lived experiences with systemic injustice. She hadn't planned to become a symbol or spokesperson, but she found meaning in using this unsolicited attention in constructive ways. The independent investigator's final report was devastating for Brennan and embarrassing for the department. It concluded that Brennan had violated multiple departmental policies and conducted an unconstitutional traffic stop without reasonable suspicion. It found that his allegations about erratic driving and marijuana odor were not supported by any evidence and appeared to be fabrications made to retroactively justify an illegal stop. It identified a pattern of behavior suggesting racial profiling. It criticized the department's failure to act on previous complaints against Brennan, and it made comprehensive recommendations for reforms including better training, stronger oversight, improved systems for tracking and investigating complaints, and real consequences for officers who violate constitutional rights. It was exactly the kind of complete vindication that Megan and civil rights advocates had hoped for, but rarely received in cases involving police misconduct. The police department had no choice but to act on the report's findings. Ignoring it would have been impossible given the intense public scrutiny and clear video documentation that supported every allegation. Brennan was formally fired from the department after a disciplinary hearing where he had the opportunity to present his defense. His attorney tried to argue that he had made an honest judgment call in a difficult situation, that traffic stops are inherently challenging and require officers to make quick decisions with incomplete information. But that argument crumbled under the weight of evidence. There was nothing difficult or ambiguous about what Brennan had done. He had stopped a driver without any articulable reason, had fabricated multiple false justifications when challenged, and had been caught in lies by his own dash camera. The disciplinary hearing didn't last long. The panel deciding his fate saw no basis for retaining an officer who had so flagrantly violated constitutional rights and then lied about it. Brennan's firing sent shockwaves through police departments across the region. Officers who had been operating with similar impunity suddenly found themselves nervous. The message was clear. Body cameras could protect you if you were doing your job correctly, but they would also expose you if you were abusing authority. Some officers complained that this would make it harder to do proactive police work, that they would be hesitant to make stops if every interaction would be scrutinized so intensely. But others, like Sergeant Mitchell, pointed out that if you're making appropriate constitutional stops based on real reasonable suspicion, you have nothing to fear from cameras or scrutiny. The problem wasn't accountability. It was that some officers had gotten accustomed to operating without it. Brennan's firing forced difficult conversations about police culture, implicit bias, and whether departments really wanted officers who couldn't articulate legal reasons for their actions. The police union initially defended Brennan, as unions typically do, arguing he was being scapegoated for broader systemic problems. They threatened legal action to try to reverse his termination. But when the complete footage of the incident was made public through open records requests, even some union members admitted privately that this wasn't a case they could credibly defend. The video was too clear, Brennan's lies too obvious, the contrast with Megan's legal knowledge too stark. The union eventually backed off from their most aggressive legal challenges, though they continued to insist Brennan deserved some form of due process. He received due process far more than many victims of police misconduct ever get, and that process found he had repeatedly violated the rights of people he had sworn to protect. Do you think the firing was enough, or should there have been criminal charges as well? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The city faced multiple lawsuits, not just from Megan, but from other drivers Brennan had illegally stopped over the years. Attorneys identified a clear pattern of Fourth Amendment violations, racial profiling, and illegal detentions. The city's legal department knew they would lose these cases if they went to trial, so they began negotiating settlements. The amounts weren't publicly disclosed in all cases, but sources suggested the city paid well over $1 million total to resolve claims related to Brennan's conduct. That money came from municipal budgets that could have gone to schools, infrastructure, or community services. Instead, it went to compensate people whose constitutional rights had been violated for years while the department looked the other way. Megan's lawsuit wasn't about money for her. She made that clear from the beginning. Her attorney structured the settlement in a way that included not just financial compensation, but specific requirements for policy reform. The department had to implement new training on constitutional stops and racial profiling. They had to create a better system for tracking complaints and identifying patterns of problematic behavior before they became full-scale crises. They had to establish civilian oversight of misconduct investigations, so it wasn't just police investigating themselves. They had to agree to regular audits of traffic stop data to identify statistical disparities that might indicate bias. These reforms were what Megan really wanted, changes that would benefit countless people who came after her. The financial compensation she received was significant, but she donated a large portion to organizations that provide legal assistance to victims of police misconduct who can't afford attorneys. Megan's story became a national case study on why knowledge of civil rights is crucial. Organizations across the country began offering workshops educating people about what to do during traffic stops. They taught the specific questions Megan had asked. Am I being detained or am I free to go? What is the reasonable, articulable suspicion for this stop? Am I legally required to consent to a search? These simple questions, when asked calmly and recorded on video, could transform a potentially dangerous encounter into a documented record that would protect rights. People learned they didn't have to be law students to understand basic Fourth Amendment concepts. They learned that polite police could still be violating their rights, and that knowing how to articulate those violations in legal language was powerful. Law schools added Megan's video to their curricula not just for students interested in criminal law or civil rights, but as a broader example of why legal education matters in everyday life. Professors pointed out how years of study and preparation had culminated in those 20 minutes on the roadside where theoretical knowledge became practical defense. They discussed how privilege played a role Megan had access to. Elite education that many victims of police misconduct don't have. She had resources to fight back through legal channels. She had the cultural capital to navigate complex systems. But they also emphasized that basic knowledge of constitutional rights should be accessible to everyone, not just those with formal legal education. Democracy works best when citizens understand their rights and can articulate them effectively. Brennan tried to find work at other police departments after his termination. Most refused to hire him once they discovered his history. The viral video had made his name so recognizable that departments knew hiring him would create instant controversy. He eventually left police work entirely, finding employment in private security where regulations and accountability were less stringent. Some people felt sorry for him, arguing everyone deserves a second chance. But others pointed out he had multiple chances over years when complaints against him were ignored. He had repeatedly chosen to abuse authority rather than serve his community faithfully. The consequences he eventually faced weren't disproportionate to the harm he had caused. They were simply the consequences that should have come much earlier if accountability systems had worked properly. Megan's legal career flourished in ways she never anticipated. Civil rights law firms sought her out for positions after graduation. She had proven she could think on her feet under pressure, that she knew the law deeply, and that she had the courage to stand up for what was right, even when confronting authority. Those qualities made her exactly the kind of attorney organizations wanted, representing clients who had been marginalized by the legal system. She eventually accepted a position with a nonprofit organization focused on police accountability and criminal justice reform. Her work involved not just litigating individual cases of misconduct, but also policy advocacy for systemic changes. She used her platform to educate lawmakers about why reforms were needed, to train communities on how to document rights violations, and to challenge departmental practices that allowed officers like Brennan to operate without consequences. Years after the incident, Megan reflected in interviews that those 20 minutes on Highway 47 had changed the trajectory of her life. She had planned to become a corporate attorney, make good money, pay off her student loans. But the experience of having her own rights violated, of using her legal knowledge to successfully defend herself, and of seeing the impact that one well-documented case could have in creating broader change had shifted her priorities. She realized that legal knowledge without practical application was sterile, that justice required not just understanding laws, but actively fighting to ensure they were applied fairly. She didn't regret how her career had unfolded. The work was harder and paid less than corporate positions would have, but it was infinitely more meaningful. She was using her law degree the way it was always supposed to be used, to protect the vulnerable and challenge the powerful. The case also impacted how police departments across the nation approached training and accountability. Megan's video became mandatory training material in many police academies, not as an example of what to do, but as a case study in avoidable catastrophe. Instructors paused the video at key points to discuss what Brennan should have done differently. When he first saw Megan driving, what specific observations would justify a stop? When she challenged the legality of the stop, how should an officer respond? What does the law actually require versus what officers sometimes assume they can do? These discussions were uncomfortable but necessary. They forced officers in training to confront the fact that their badge didn't give them unlimited authority, that citizens had rights that must be respected even when that made police work harder. Megan and Brennan's story didn't end when the lawsuits were settled or when departmental policies were reformed. It continued living in the community's consciousness, always aware that her experience had become part of a much larger, national conversation about race, policing, and justice. She regularly received messages from people who had watched her video and felt empowered to stand up for themselves in their own interactions with police. Some of these stories ended well, with officers backing down when confronted with rights-knowledgeable citizens. Others ended tragically, grim reminders that knowledge isn't always enough to protect you when systems are built to fail certain people. Megan carried these stories with her, the victories and the losses, understanding that her case had been exceptional in many ways. She was fortunate that the situation didn't escalate violently, that she had resources to fight back, that the video captured everything so clearly that denial was impossible. Years passed, and the video of that traffic stop still circulated on social media whenever conversations about police reform gained national attention. Each time another incident of police misconduct made headlines, people shared Megan's video as an example of how citizens could effectively defend themselves. But she always emphasized in interviews that focusing only on individual accountability missed the bigger point. Brennan wasn't just one bad apple in an otherwise healthy barrel. He was a symptom of deeper systemic problems about how police are trained, who gets recruited for police work, how departments handle complaints, and why so often officers get the benefit of the doubt while civilians are presumed guilty until proven innocent. Fixing these systemic problems required much more than firing individual officers when their misdeeds were finally exposed. It required fundamentally rethinking how society approaches public safety. Megan became a sought-after speaker at conferences on criminal justice and police reform. She spoke not just about her specific case, but about the broader legal and moral principles at stake. She discussed the Fourth Amendment not as an abstract concept, but as a vital protection against governmental overreach. She explained how racial profiling worked not through overt explicit racism, but through 1,000 small decisions about who looks suspicious, who deserves additional scrutiny, who should have their explanations believed. She challenged audiences to consider how society balanced legitimate law enforcement needs with equally legitimate rights of individuals to live free from unjustified harassment. These talks were never comfortable. They forced people to confront unpleasant truths about how systems they trusted worked differently for different people. What do you think needs to change to prevent cases like this from happening in the future? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The impact of Megan's case extended beyond police. Training and policy reform to inspire a generation of young students, particularly students of color, to consider law as a tool for social change. Law schools reported increases in applications from students citing Megan's story as motivation for studying constitutional law and civil rights. These students saw that legal knowledge wasn't just about making money at corporate firms. It was about having the power to challenge injustice effectively. They understood that representation mattered in the legal system, that having lawyers and judges who understood the experiences of marginalized communities could make a real difference in how justice was administered. Megan's story became unexpected recruitment for the legal profession, demonstrating why society needed people who understood both law and the lived experience of discrimination. The police department where Brennan worked implemented the reforms required by Megan's settlement, though with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some changes were genuinely embraced by leadership that recognized old practices had failed both the community and good faith officers equally. Other changes were implemented minimally, efforts to comply with the letter, but not the spirit of reform requirements. This was predictable. Institutional change is never easy, especially in organizations with deeply entrenched cultures and power structures resistant to external accountability. But even imperfect reforms represented progress from a status quo where misconduct could continue for years without consequences. And the presence of civilian oversight meant there were at least mechanisms to identify when implementation was failing and apply pressure for improvements. Some of Brennan's fellow officers left the department in the years following the scandal, claiming that policy changes had made it impossible to do effective police work. They complained about micromanagement, about having to justify every decision, about a culture of suspicion toward police. But other officers, including Sergeant Mitchell, embraced the reforms. Mitchell eventually became a training instructor focusing on appropriate constitutional stops and de-escalation. He used Megan's video extensively in his training sessions, being brutally honest with recruits about how the department had failed and what needed to change. He emphasized that real police work required restraint, judgment, and respect for constitutional rights. He challenged the notion that being an effective officer meant intimidating people into submission. True law enforcement, he argued, required earning community trust through professional conduct, not demanding deference through fear. Megan's journey from law student to civil rights attorney to nationally recognized voice on criminal justice reform had been unlikely. She never sought the spotlight, never wanted to become a public figure. But when the moment demanded that she stand up for herself, when the system tried to violate her and presumed she wouldn't know how to fight back, she had the resources of knowledge and courage to stand firm. And when it became clear that her individual experience could serve a greater purpose educating others and pushing for systemic change, she embraced that responsibility despite the personal toll it carried. She lived with post-traumatic stress from having been stopped without reason, from having faced an armed officer who was fabricating allegations against her, from knowing that the situation could have escalated dangerously at any moment. But she channeled that trauma into advocacy that helped prevent others from experiencing the same injustice. Brennan, meanwhile, largely disappeared from public view after losing police work. Occasional reports suggested he had struggled to find stable employment, that his reputation followed him wherever he went. Some people argued this was excessively punitive, that he had paid his debt by losing his career and shouldn't be punished indefinitely. Others countered that the consequences of violating people's constitutional rights should be lasting, that allowing officers to simply move to other jobs without ongoing accountability sent the wrong message. There were no easy answers about how much contrition was enough or what kind of redemption was possible for someone who had so systematically abused power. What was clear was that Brennan represented a much larger systemic failure than any individual. He had been allowed to operate as he did because systems designed to prevent misconduct had repeatedly failed. The permanence of the video online ensured that future generations would study this case. Law professors would use it in perpetuity as an example of Terry stops and reasonable suspicion. Police academy instructors would show it as a cautionary tale. Civil rights educators would share it teaching people to document encounters. The video's virality had transformed a single 20-minute moment into a permanent lesson accessible to anyone with an internet connection. This meant that Megan's impact would continue far beyond her own life and career. Decades from now, students would still watch this young woman calmly citing Supreme Court precedent while an officer tried to intimidate her into submission. They would still learn from this example that knowledge is power, that rights only exist when people know them and exercise them, and that documentation can be the difference between justice and impunity. For other victims of Brennan's misconduct who came forward after Megan's case, there were mixed feelings of validation and bitterness. They were grateful that finally someone had succeeded in holding him accountable, but it hurt knowing that their own complaints had been ignored for years. If the department had acted when they reported, how many subsequent illegal stops could have been prevented? That question haunted not just victims, but also officers like Mitchell who had remained silent when they should have spoken up. There were painful lessons here about the cost of inaction, about how allowing problematic behavior to continue always leads to more harm eventually. Systems don't fix themselves. It takes people willing to challenge the status quo even when it's uncomfortable or personally costly. Megan looked back on that night on Highway 47 with a complex mixture of emotions. She wished it had never happened, that she could have simply driven home from that study session without interruption. But since it did happen, she was grateful that she had the knowledge and resources to transform it into a teaching moment and catalyst for change. She recognized her privileges, not privilege of race, because as a black woman she had clearly been targeted based on race, but privilege of elite education and legal literacy that enabled her to defend herself effectively. She felt a responsibility to use those privileges on behalf of those without the same advantages. Her work with civil rights organizations was about paying it forward, about ensuring that the justice she had achieved wasn't an exception, but began to become the norm. If this story meant something to you, make sure you're subscribed. Share it with someone who needs to see it. Stories like Megan's need to be told because they're real, they're documented, and they show that sometimes justice actually happens when people refuse to accept injustice. The case also raised important questions about the future of policing in a nation increasingly aware of how differently laws enforced across different communities. It wasn't enough to say that most officers were well-intentioned if systems allowed ill-intentioned ones to operate without accountability. It wasn't enough to point to officers like Mitchell as proof that not all cops were bad if the culture of silence prevented good cops from reporting bad ones. Real change would require transforming not just policies, but culture within law enforcement, creating an environment where accountability was expected and not exceptional, where serving the community meant respecting the rights of all members equally. Years after the traffic stop, Megan's encounter with Brennan remained profoundly relevant because the problems it exposed persisted. Officers still made pretextual stops. Black and brown drivers were still disproportionately targeted. Accountability systems still frequently failed victims of misconduct. But there was also progress. More departments had body cameras. More officers received training on implicit bias. More communities had mechanisms for civilian oversight. More people knew their rights and how to articulate them. These incremental changes, while insufficient on their own, represented movement in the right direction. And cases like Megan's, where injustice was so clearly documented and consequences so definitively applied, helped maintain pressure to continue progress. The final lesson from this case wasn't that the E2I system always works, because clearly it doesn't. It was that the combination of individual knowledge, careful documentation, persistent advocacy, and sustained public pressure can sometimes force the system to work as it should. Megan didn't change everything alone. She was part of a much larger movement of people fighting for accountability and reform. But her story powerfully demonstrated what was possible when someone refused to accept rights violations as inevitable. Each person who watched that video and learned about Terry versus Ohio, about the Fourth Amendment, about the importance of asking for reasonable, articulable suspicion, became slightly more empowered to protect their own rights and the rights of others. Knowledge replicated itself this way, spreading through communities and generations. Brennan had his police career ended by a body camera he presumed would protect him. Megan had her life transformed by legal knowledge she never expected to need to use this way. Their confrontation on that roadside became a lesson that millions studied, and the message remained clear. Rights exist not as theoretical abstractions, but as practical protections that individuals must know and exercise. When those protections are violated, documentation matters, persistence matters, refusing to accept injustice matters. And sometimes, just sometimes, justice prevails, not because the system automatically corrects itself, but because people insist on accountability even when it's difficult, even when it's scary, even when the odds seem stacked against them. That was Megan's lasting contribution, not just winning her own case, but inspiring countless others to stand up for themselves and demand that laws supposedly protecting everyone be enforced equitably.